Okay, hopefully I got this set up about right. Topic for today is beavers. Figured I'd highlight something that's a keystone species that we've got. And back in pre-Columbian times, basically beavers were found anywhere there was water, coast to coast, from the Gulf of Mexico all the way up into, maybe not all the way down to the Gulf of Mexico, most of the United States at any rate. I'm a little unsure on exactly how far south they went, but they're definitely all through Canada, all through the Northeast, the Appalachians, the Rockies. Don't see why they wouldn't have been along the coast, but yeah, they're pretty much nationwide. It's probably, like many things, a little hard to say where they were and where they weren't at this point in time because they've been gone for most of that area for so long. Beavers do a lot of things. They're what they call a keystone species. They change their environment, and a lot of other species basically rely on them. A lot of what we know of other species is probably somewhat incorrect because the golden age of your botanists and your naturalists was like the mid to late 1800s. By 1820 roughly, beavers were in such short supply and in such demand that people were chasing them into the Rocky Mountains because they were basically wiped out everywhere east of there. They were already, way the hell away from civilization, far away from the Mississippi River, which was a trading route, and any of the towns and cities or anything that could be considered the beaten path. Technically, I think there are a few little pockets here and there in the northern Appalachians, but not enough to support the fur trade. The fur traders were all in the Rockies by the early 1800s. Back going into the 1600s at least, the French and the English were trading with the Indians, and the various Indian tribes, it created wars among them, everything else. Everybody was fighting for the furs that they could trade and get guns and whatever else from the Europeans. So the decline in beaver populations actually preceded the expansion of Europeans. And then the Europeans actually went in and started doing their own trapping. Even in this region where I'm at, around Pittsburgh, the English were supposed to stay on their side of the Appalachians, but they didn't. They had a post out here called Logstown where they traded with the Indian tribes for furs and other things. Logstown is modern day Baden. It's where I grew up. It's right across the river from where I live now in Aliquippa. And this whole area was claimed by the French, and the French voyageurs, as they were called, went on these big trapping expeditions. They traded and trapped, and they go way into the interior through the Great Lakes and up rivers and everything, and they would both come down through the Great Lakes and St. Lawrence, and also they would portage over and come down the Ohio River and Mississippi River drainages and go down to New Orleans. And it was a huge trade at the time. These beaver pelts went back to Europe, and they were the height of fashion and everything, and people were just burning through these things, but beavers were wiped out to such an extent before, like I said, the naturalists and everything came along later. And I've often, now there have been studies done, I believe mostly in Yellowstone, where when the beavers were gone, I thought the beavers were a detriment. They're cutting down all these trees and that, and they realized that they were this huge support for the environment. One of the things the beavers do in damming up these creeks is it helps dissipate the peaks of the storm. Imagine, water's rushing down this valley, it hits this pond that has to kind of spread out and slow down. And then it eventually, it goes out of the pond again, but it kind of slows down that peak. It kind of absorbs it. So you got a whole bunch of these little ponds, and it slows down the erosion. It lets things grow differently along the banks in between storms, because you don't have as high of a flood level, and you don't have as fast a water. You don't have as much erosion. So it's helping the fish and the plant species and everything else in that portion in between where the beavers aren't even active. And this has an effect, slowing it down the water. Any sediment that's been picked up by erosion will tend to fall out, and that makes the water downstream of a beaver dam a little bit cleaner. And that has effects going into larger bodies of water and even the ocean itself. You're holding back all that silt. The other thing is it is creating openings in the canopy. And there's a lot of species that need this. I mean, there's turtles native to the Northeast and Appalachia, and most turtles like ponds. There are no natural ponds except for up in the glaciated areas far to the north. There's really not a whole lot of natural ponds in lakes, and the beavers created them. They created habitat for fish and reptiles and amphibians and plants that need this slower water and that need sunlight. Turtles like to be able to sun themselves somewhere. Even things like wood turtles that live in the faster water, they need a place to haul out and get a little bit of sun. And all the different plants, there's, where did the sun-living species native to the Northeast live if there were no openings? And that's why the beavers are very important. And like I said, they've been lost from the environment. Now, a lot of places, they're starting to let them go back into some of the state game lands around here. There's a couple of them near me where there are beavers active now. But in a lot of areas, they still try to keep them away, because they dam up the creek, it floods up somebody's house or this or that. Everybody resists the change, but you don't realize that change is part of what the natural environment was. We no longer have any kind of an allowance for these changes to happen, but there's a famous quote, I forget who the hell said it, or if anybody even knows who originally said it, that when the first Europeans got here, a squirrel could make it from the Atlantic Ocean to the Mississippi River, jumping from tree to tree and never touch the ground. Probably true, but you can make it from one end to the other of a block of Swiss cheese without necessarily crossing one of the holes. So it's kind of the same thing. There, even though, yes, there were parts where the forest was full of trees that were hundreds of years old and never was affected by fire or any major damage, and was just old. There's also places where you had this turnover. There were the breaks, there were the openings, and these openings allowed for new regeneration. And that's one of the things that the beavers do. They provided this habitat for the plants and the animals that need the sunlight. And also, beavers tend to eat what they like to eat, mainly willows, aspen, things like that. And when they start running out of trees that they like to eat, they move on. It makes a turnover in the species. Otherwise, you know, a different effect that's happened from logging is when you cut down a hardwood tree, it'll resprout from the stump. You do that to a pine tree, with the exception of pitch pine, they don't. So every time the forests were logged, they slowly became more and more hardwood. Not that this was ever 100% pine, but it shifted the balance more than it originally was. Beavers tend to eat hardwoods. They tend not to like pine trees. This is something in nature that would shift that balance back. And that, you know, it's missing now. But, you know, if it wasn't for beavers, probably wouldn't be a lot of painted turtles, sunfish, bass, pond lilies, any of that stuff in the east. They're the thing that created that habitat, and it's just another example of how, you know, the butterfly effect of one thing affects everything else, and this is a very prominent, well-documented example.